The sky over Earth was a canvas of stars, serene and silent, until the Xelthar Empire arrived. Their flagship, named the Eclipse of Worlds, was a colossal construct, its metallic hull black as night, and its dimensions so vast that it blotted out the sun wherever it hovered. Smaller warships, each the size of a city, orbited around it, their shields shimmering and weapons ready, casting long shadows over oceans and continents. From the flagship's bridge, High Warlord Krixan stood, his figure towering, draped in ceremonial armor, which pulsed with crimson light, a sign of rank and power. His eyes, slits of molten gold, surveyed the planet below. The holographic display showed Earth's continents, illuminated in soft blue, as if waiting to be claimed. "Initiate contact," Krixan's voice rumbled, like stones grinding deep within the earth. His mandibles clicked, a habitual sign of impatience, as the communication officers activated the broad-spectrum transmission systems. Every device on Earth, from smartphones to televisions, billboards to radio signals, suddenly shifted to a single broadcast. The image of Krixan filled screens worldwide, his alien visage sharp, unfamiliar, and terrifying. His voice, translated into every human language, echoed with an unnatural clarity, as if he stood in the room of every viewer. "People of Earth," he began, his tone devoid of emotion, "you are now subjects of the Xelthar Empire. Your planet, your lives, and your futures belong to us. Surrender and submit. Resistance will not be tolerated. You have 1 Earth hour to comply." As the message looped, panic rippled through cities, towns, and villages. Governments scrambled, military units mobilized, and leaders held emergency meetings, their faces pale, their voices rising, as desperation replaced logic. The news channels struggled to decipher the broadcast, but the image of Krixan's unblinking stare remained, muting their attempts to calm the masses. In Washington, D.C., the president's war room was chaos incarnate. Generals argued, scientists whispered, and the president sat frozen, his fists clenched, as strategists showed maps, highlighting the fleet's position and estimating the destruction they could unleash. "Nuclear weapons?" a general suggested, his voice brittle. "No use," replied a scientist. "Their shields are beyond anything we've ever encountered. We'd only incinerate ourselves." Across the globe, similar scenes unfolded. In London, Beijing, Moscow, and Delhi, the human race stood on the edge of surrender, with no clear path forward. But as the countdown continued, a new signal broke through. It was faint, originating from deep within the wilderness, a remote forested region in Alaska, where no military bases existed and no major infrastructure lay. The signal disrupted Krixan's broadcast, static-filled screens, and then a new voice emerged, calm, unhurried, and eerily composed. "High Warlord Krixan, I speak for humanity. We will not surrender. We suggest you leave while you still can." The words were simple, but the tone held weight, a gravity that lingered in the air. The Xelthar commanders, who had been monitoring human communications, paused, their instruments showing no trace of a military source, no hidden base, and no organized threat. "A trick," Krixan dismissed, his mandibles clicking sharply. "They try to stall us. Locate the source. Send a scout team. Make an example of whoever this is." But as the scout ships descended, piercing the clouds, and heading toward the wilderness, a sense of unease crept through the bridge. The Xelthar officers, veterans of countless conquests, felt an alien sensation, doubt. The human's voice played again, this time directly through the ship's systems, as if it had bypassed security, weaving through channels and emerging from shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." The Xelthar systems flickered, the lights dimmed, and the bridge descended into twilight, where technology faltered and fear began to breathe. And as the ship's scanners swept the earth, they found nothing, only trees swaying, rivers flowing, and a lone figure, sitting by a campfire, waiting. His silhouette small, unremarkable, but in his stillness, there was a promise, a silent warning, that the empire that considered itself indestructible had just made its first mistake. The forests of Alaska were a mosaic of green and white, where pines pierced the sky and the ground remained blanketed with the last whispers of winter snow. The air hung still, as if the world itself held its breath, waiting. The Xelthar dropships cut through the cloud cover, their engines humming, but the forest floor remained undisturbed, the animals silent, as the alien shadows passed over them. The scout team, a squad of 10, emerged from the dropship, their exosuits humming with energy, black metal gleaming under the pale sunlight. Their helmets, smooth and expressionless, displayed data streams and thermal readings, but the screens showed nothing, only the cold blue of wilderness and the soft warmth of life beneath the soil. "This is the location," the squad leader, Lieutenant Virak, muttered, his voice transmitted through the group's comms, the language sharp like glass scraping against stone. "Scanners show no infrastructure, no weapons, no threats." Just like the others, a soldier snickered, his weapon emitting a soft pulse, ready to discharge plasma at the slightest sign of danger. Humans hide behind words. This one will squeal like the rest. The team moved forward, their steps synchronized, leaves crunching under heavy boots, and their suits adjusting colors to blend with the forest. They spread out, their helmets scanning, but no movement registered, no threats detected, and the world remained too quiet, as if the forest itself had turned its back on them. And then they saw him. In a small clearing, a campfire burned, its flames gentle, casting long shadows over the snow-speckled ground. John Riley, a lone figure, sat cross-legged, his hands cradling a tin cup, steam rising in the chill air. His jacket was worn, his boots muddy, but his demeanor was calm, his eyes reflecting the firelight, as if he had expected them all along. The Xelthar soldiers froze, their weapons raised, as thermal scans showed nothing unusual, only a human body, average vitals, and no hidden tech. "Identify yourself," Virak commanded, his visor narrowing, the edges of his suit bristling with light, as if preparing for attack. John looked up, sipped his drink, and smiled. "Name's John. Would you like some coffee?" The soldiers exchanged glances, their masks unreadable, but their postures tightened, as if the man's calmness was a weapon they did not understand. "On your knees," another soldier barked, his plasma rifle charging, blue light pulsing against the forest shadows. John sighed, set his cup down, and knelt, his movements slow, unthreatening. As they approached, he offered no resistance, his hands held out, palms open, and when they bound him, their metal restraints clicking, he only chuckled. "What's so amusing, human?" Virak's tone dripped with disdain, his mandibles twitching under his helmet. "You've made a mistake," John whispered, his voice soft, but each word fell with the weight of stone, sinking into the soldiers' minds, lingering. They pushed him forward, their hands heavy, and marched him toward the dropship, but the forest seemed to close in behind them, branches brushing, shadows leaning, as if the trees whispered among themselves. On the flight back, the soldiers remained silent, their helmets reflecting only the dim glow of the ship's interior. John sat on the floor, hands bound, but his posture relaxed, his eyes closed, as if he were dozing off, unbothered by the aliens who loomed over him. One soldier nudged him with his boot, a sharp jab to the ribs, but John didn't react, his breathing steady, and for a moment, the others felt a chill, though the temperature remained constant. "What if he's not? Right?" a young soldier whispered, his voice barely audible, but the calms amplified the tremor in his tone. "Silence." Virak snapped, but his own claws tightened, his grip on his weapon whitening the knuckles beneath the suit. As the dropship docked and the mothership loomed, a dark silhouette against the stars, John opened his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the entire ship flickered, the lights dimmed, and screens rebooted, showing static and then nothing. The soldiers hesitated, but John stood up, walking forward, his chains dragging, but his steps even, as if he walked a familiar path. And as the doors opened and the dark corridors of the mothership swallowed him, the whispers began, soft at first, but growing a chorus of echoes, as if the ship itself had awakened and the shadows watched, their eyes unblinking, as the human anomaly entered the heart of the Indestructible Empire, and nothing would ever be the same again. The detention cells of the Xelthar flagship were not mere prison quarters. They were instruments of control. Each cell was a cube of metallic walls, illuminated by a harsh white light that never dimmed, erasing all sense of time. The air was sterile, cold, carrying a faint hum of energy fields, which kept prisoners weak and pliant. John Riley sat on the metal bench, his hands still bound, though the restraints had powered down, as if the ship itself was unsure of how to hold him. His demeanor remained calm, his eyes half closed, as if he were meditating, while the walls around him breathed, panels shifting and screens flickering with alien symbols. In the observation room, Commander Krixan stood behind a transparent barrier, his clawed fingers drumming against the control panel. Beside him, Science Officer Xelthar monitored the feeds, her mandibles twitching as the data returned nothing unusual. Physiology, standard human. No enhancements. Mental readings, erratic. Her voice, usually sharp, held a note of confusion. It's as if his mind is void. A void cannot resist us, Krixan retorted, his golden eyes narrowing. Begin the interrogation. Show him that resistance is futile. A panel on the cell wall slid open, revealing a holographic display, and John's eyes snapped open, his expression shifting, not to fear, but to mild curiosity. The display pulsed, and a soft hum filled the air, a subsonic frequency designed to disorient and break the will of weaker beings. John Riley of Earth. A disembodied voice echoed, its tone modulated, neither human nor alien, but mechanical, designed to pierce into the mind. You are a prisoner of a Xelthar Empire. Compliance will ensure survival. Defiance will lead to extinction. John remained silent, his head tilted, as if he were listening to a distant sound, something beyond the ship, beyond the walls. And for a moment, the display glitched, the symbols warping, and lines of static crawling across the surface. Identify your military rank. I'm not military, John replied, his voice soft, but it carried, filling the cell and the observation room beyond. Your purpose here? Camping mostly. Wasn't expecting company, though. He smiled, a small gesture, but it bent the air as if the space around him rippled and the lights above dimmed, only for a second, but enough to make the Xelthar officers exchange wary glances. Your species is inferior. You will provide intelligence on human defenses. Defenses? John chuckled, a low, rumbling sound, and the display crackled, a flash of static, as if his laughter disrupted frequencies. I'm afraid you've got the wrong guy. I'm just a traveler. A storyteller, maybe. Would you like to hear a story? In the observation room, Xelthar's monitors blinked, screens cycling through data, but the readings made no sense. Commander, his neural activity, it's fluctuating. Our probes are looping. Looping? Explain. Every attempt to read his mind brings us back to the same point. His responses create echoes. Run the mind probe. Direct insertion. Make him compliant. Krixan's voice hardened, his patience thinning, as he pressed his palm against the panel, initiating the neural link. In the cell, the walls brightened, and a needle-thin beam of light descended, piercing through John's forehead, though his skin remained unbroken. His eyes rolled back, but he did not scream, did not react, only his breathing slowed, as if he were falling asleep. The neural probe, designed to shatter mental defenses, revealed a mind unlike any the Xelthar had encountered. The usual human mindscape was a tangle of memories, emotions, and sensory inputs, but John's mind was a maze of corridors, each path leading back to the start. Loops within loops, echoes of thoughts, shadows of memories, and the deeper the probe went, the further lost it became. Xelthar's console sparked, and she stepped back, her helmet feeding static in her ears, and for a moment, she thought she heard whispering, not in Xelthar, but in English, John's voice repeating, "You've made a mistake." On the screen, the cell remained still, But the light above John flickered, and shadows moved, though there was nothing to cast them. The probe retracted, and John lifted his head, his eyes bright, as if he had just awoken from a dream, and he smiled. "Is that all?" In the command room, Krixan's claws dug into metal, leaving grooves, his mandibles grinding. "Increase the pressure. Make him submit." But as the settings adjusted, the ship shuddered, a pulse of energy surged, and the screens died, plunging the room into darkness. And for a moment, all they could hear was the soft hum of John's voice, still whispering through the comms, though his lips did not move. And in the darkness, shadows shifted, and Krixan realized that the prisoner had become the captor, and the Xelthar Empire, with all its technology, had no defense against a mind they could not comprehend. The lower decks of the Xelthar Mothership, usually a hive of efficiency, had become hushed and empty, as if the ship itself held its breath. The long corridors, lined with bioluminescent strips, now flickered inconsistently, casting jagged shadows that danced on metallic walls. The ship's hum, a steady presence, now warbled, as if something deep within its core trembled. The engineers moved cautiously, their exosuits clanking, but even the servos seemed offbeat, their usual smooth rhythm stuttering, as if the ship's pulse had skipped. They passed through bulkheads, weapons drawn, but the air itself seemed thicker, heavier, and each step felt like wading through mist. System diagnostic initiated, a mechanical voice intoned, but the screens displayed static, and the readout showed only gibberish, alien symbols scrambled, as if a child had played with their controls. "Check the power lines," Chief Engineer Vinyl commanded, his helmet's visor dimming, feeding back shadows rather than light. "Power is stable," a subordinate replied, his hands shaky as he pulled wires, but the cables felt warm, pulsing, and he dropped them, yelping as if he had touched flesh instead of metal. "You are acting like primitives," Vinyl snapped, his voice sharp, but the echo lingered, repeating his words back, but in a softer tone, a whisper, as if the walls themselves were mocking him. As the team continued, the lights above shifted, turning red, then blue, and then fading altogether, leaving only the emergency lights, which bathed everything in a sickly green glow. The corridors twisted, their angles wrong, and doors led back to where they had started, creating a loop. "Commander Krixan," Vinyl spoke into his comms, but only static returned, and beneath it, he heard breathing, soft, measured, as if someone stood behind him, but when he turned, there was nothing. "Something is wrong," another engineer whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, but it carried, and the others stopped, their helmet visors reflecting distorted images, as if the space around them had bent. In the detention cell, John Riley sat, his hands still bound, but his eyes open, his expression distant, as if he were listening to music that only he could hear. The walls of his cell shivered, metal groaning, and the panels behind him twisted, forming patterns, shapes that spiraled, and then returned to normal, as if the ship had exhaled. Back in the lower decks, Vinyl's team reached the reactor room, the core of the ship, where the energy field pulsed, feeding power to every system. But the core had dimmed, its blue light murky, as if tainted by shadows. "Restart the system," Vinyl ordered, but the console showed nothing, only a black screen. And when he pressed the controls, his fingers sank deeper, as if the panel had become liquid, and he pulled his hand back, sticky with a dark residue. The team recoiled, their lights darting, and the walls began to move, panels shifting, as if breathing. The shadows deepened, and from the vents, a sound emerged, a whisper, soft but persistent, and it spoke in English. "You've made a mistake." The lights blinked, and John's voice echoed, not through the comms, but through the ship itself, as if the vessel had become his voice box. "Systems compromised," the mechanical voice announced, but it no longer sounded mechanical. It laughed, a child's giggle, twisting into static, and the emergency lights turned red, pulsing with the beat of a heart. "Shut it down," Vinyl screamed, his helmet fogging, and his visor cracked, but the shadows pressed closer, and the engineers saw figures moving, human silhouettes, eyes bright, but when they fired, the bullets passed through and the figures dissolved like mist. The reactor core dimmed and the temperature dropped. Frost crawled over metal and screens shattered, showing John's face, smiling, his lips moving, but his words emerged from the walls, from the ceiling, from within their suits. The ship is mine now. The engineers stumbled, tools falling, as the floor seemed to tilt and the gravity generators pulsed, sending them weightless and then slamming them down, as if the ship itself rejected them. On the bridge, Commander Krixan watched, his feed showing chaos, soldiers running, systems failing, and in the darkened hallways, the shadows moved, human figures walking slowly, their faces blank, but their eyes burning, as if the ship had birthed nightmares, and the crew had become its prey. And in his cell, John sat, his hands slipping free of the restraints, and the door opened, as if the ship had bowed to him, welcoming him deeper. And as he stood, his shadow stretched, blending with the walls, slipping into the systems, and turning the Indestructible Empire into dust and whispers. The command center of the Xelthar Mothership, once a fortress of order, had become a cathedral of chaos. The holographic displays, which usually bathed the room in blue light, now flickered erratically, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally against the metal walls. The main console emitted a low hum, not the steady rhythm of a functioning system, but a nervous tremor, as if the ship itself shivered. Commander Krixan stood at the center, his mandibles twitching, his eyes darting between screens, each showing fragments of a nightmare. The ship's sensors displayed dozens of false readings, ghost signals appearing and vanishing, as if Earth itself breathed beneath them, warping reality. Report, Krixan barked, but his voice lacked its usual edge, the authority diminished, and his officers hesitated, their helmets feeding back static, visors reflecting only static and shadows. Sir, Tactical Officer Vilox stammered, his claws tapping against his console. The lower decks are unresponsive. Engineering teams report distortions. They claim the ship is haunted. Haunted. Krixan's mandibles clicked, the sound sharp, but beneath the steel of his expression, there was something softer, something dangerous, fear. You are soldiers of the Xelthar Empire, not hatchlings afraid of the dark. Restore order. Send reinforcements. Purge the systems. I've tried, Commander, Vilox whispered, his eyes unfocused, as if he were watching something beyond the screen. The systems do not respond. And in the whispers, they know my name. Krixan turned sharply, his armored foot striking the floor, metal against metal, the sound echoing, but the echo did not fade. It repeated, softening, until it became a whisper, not in Xelthar, but in English, John Riley's voice, weaving through the comms, filling the air, and seeping into the walls. You've made a mistake. The lights dimmed, and for a heartbeat, the command center fell into darkness, a void where the screens died and shadows crept closer, their edges frayed, as if they were hungry. When the lights returned, the display showed new data, a location within the ship, the detention cell, but the door was open and the cell was empty. He's loose, Vilox muttered, his voice thin, as if strangled by unseen hands. The human, he's everywhere. Activate the lockdown. Krixan's voice cracked, the sound bouncing back, but the consoles remained silent. Buttons unresponsive, and the screens bled static, white noise that shaped words, John's words, the ship is mine. In the lower decks, soldiers moved cautiously, their armor reflecting distorted corridors. But each turn led them back, and doors opened to empty rooms, identical in every way, as if the ship had become a maze, reconfiguring itself, trapping them. The shadows moved, figures walking through walls, their eyes bright, but their bodies transparent. And when one soldier fired, the bullet passed through, striking a wall, and ricocheting, hitting another Xelthar, who fell silently, his blood black against the floor. On the command bridge, the holographic map of Earth glitched, the continents twisted, and the seas turned red, And when the view shifted, the ship's sensors displayed nothing but darkness, as if they had been swallowed by a void. General communication compromised, the ship's AI announced, but its voice was no longer mechanical. It mimicked John's tone, playful, soft, as if he were speaking to children. "Shall I tell you a story?" The screens flashed, showing images from Earth, ancient ruins, faces of humans, but their expressions were wrong, eyes hollow. And when Krixan looked closer, he saw his own reflection, but with human eyes, staring back, unblinking. "Purge the ship," he ordered, but the weapons did not fire. The security systems remained silent, and the gravity shifted, tilting the floor, sending officers stumbling, their movements sluggish, as if the air had thickened. And then, the comm systems crackled, and John's voice emerged, not as a whisper, but clear, resonant, as if he stood among them, though his figure remained unseen. "You came to conquer, but you brought only fear. Now, you'll understand what it means to be afraid." The command center doors opened, but beyond them was not the corridor, only darkness, and shapes moved within, silhouettes of humans, their eyes reflecting light, and when the first officer stepped forward, he vanished, his scream echoing, but never ending, as if he had fallen into an endless pit. The screen showed nothing, only static, and the soldiers who remained began to remove their helmets, their expressions blank, as if something had taken their minds, and they sat on the floor, their weapons discarded, muttering in English, though they had never learned the language. "Tell me a story, John," they whispered, their voices blending, and Krixan stepped back, his mandibles trembling. As the darkness crept closer, John's voice looping, and the lights faded, leaving only shadows, which moved with purpose, as if the ship itself had become a predator, and the Xelthar, once mighty, had become prey. In the detention cell, now empty, the walls remained warm, as if something lived within, and John's figure, though nowhere to be seen, was everywhere, his whisper a heartbeat, and the Xelthar Empire, which had conquered worlds, now faced an enemy it could neither see nor fight, an infection of fear spreading like smoke, until nothing remained but silence. The Mothership was no longer a vessel of steel and circuits. It had become a living nightmare, a labyrinth where logic failed and reality twisted. The corridors, once straight and sterile, now curved unnaturally, their angles wrong, as if the ship's architecture had grown bones and sinew, breathing with each pulse of John Riley's voice. Commander Krixan moved through the command bridge, his footsteps slow, as if the floor pulled against him, gravity thickened, and the air hummed with a low vibration, like a beast growling from the shadows. The remaining officers sat motionless, their eyes vacant, their mouths repeating phrases in English, John's words, though their native tongue had no human sounds. "You've made a mistake," they whispered, their voices layered, blending into the static that bled from the screens, which showed nothing but darkness, punctuated by flashes of human faces, expressions blank, and eyes unblinking. The holographic displays that once mapped galaxies now projected visions of Earth, but the landscapes shifted, skies darkened, and shadows moved where no being stood. Forests breathed, cities crumbled, and oceans turned black, as if the ship's systems had become windows into a nightmare, rather than reality. "Control room, respond," Krixan hissed, his voice tight, but the comms remained dead. Only soft whispers answered, and he recognized his own voice, repeating orders he had never given, directing soldiers into traps, leading them to doors that opened into nothingness. In the lower decks, the remaining engineers and soldiers wandered like phantoms, their helmets removed, their expressions slack, as they moved through repeating corridors, their footsteps echoing, but never leading anywhere. They followed sounds, John's laughter, soft music, and the gentle patter of rain, but each turn brought them back, as if the ship had curled in on itself, a serpent devouring its own tail. The energy core, usually a sphere of pulsing blue light, had dimmed, its color turned to an ashen gray, and shadows danced within its crystal structure, human shapes, eyes glowing, as if the energy itself had become infected, and the power that once drove the Indestructible Empire now served another will. "Purge the system," Krixan whispered, but his commands fell into the void, and the ship's AI, usually obedient, now responded in John's voice, playful, mimicking the commander's tone, but twisting his words, turning orders into riddles. "Are you lost, Commander?" the AI asked, its voice coming from all directions, echoing through the vents, sliding through the walls. "Would you like me to guide you?" "Shut down. Reset. Override all systems." Krixan slammed his fist against the control panel, but the metal bent, as if softened by heat, and shadows bled from the cracks, crawling up his arm, cold as death, leaving frost on his armor. The lights dimmed, and the emergency alarms began to sing, not the sharp tones of danger, but a lullaby, soft, melancholic, and the screen showed only a forest, John's silhouette by a campfire, his back turned, but his shadow stretched, reaching into the ship, and Krixan felt its fingers brush his mind, cold and sharp. "Who are you?" Krixan whispered, his mandibles trembling, his armor suddenly heavy, as if gravity had doubled. "Just a storyteller." John's voice filled the room, and Krixan turned, but there was nothing, only the shadows, which moved against the light, faces forming, mouths open, but their screams were silent. The soldiers, trapped in the lower decks, began to turn on each other, their minds unraveling, as visions filled their helmets, family members speaking softly, dead worlds rising, and hands reaching from the floor, pulling them into the metal until their bodies vanished, but their shadows remained, walking alongside those still lost. In the energy core room, the lights died, and the pulse of the ship slowed, as if the vessel itself took its last breath, and the mothership, once a spear of conquest, became a coffin, drifting in Earth's orbit, its engines cold, its guns silent, and John's voice remained, a whisper that filled every corridor, turned every screen dark, and every shadow into a doorway, leading to nowhere. The galaxy would soon learn, not through messages, but through the silence, that the Xelthar Empire, which had conquered 100 worlds, had fallen, not by fleet or force, but by a single human who had turned their greatest weapon into his playground and left nothing behind but echoes and ashes. And as the mothership drifted, John's silhouette stood in the holographic display, watching the Earth, his eyes calm, as if he had always belonged there, a shadow among shadows, unseen, but everywhere, and the ship creaked, whispering his name, as the universe shuddered and the stars turned away for fear of the human who had turned darkness into his weapon and the Indestructible Empire into dust. The mothership, once a monument of power, now drifted helplessly, a colossal shadow against the blue curve of Earth. Its engines sputtered, energy cores flickered, and hull breaches vented atmosphere into the void as the once indestructible empire teetered on the brink of oblivion. Within its corridors, shadows moved not with purpose, but with madness. The Xelthar soldiers, who had marched as conquerors, now wandered as phantoms, their eyes hollow, mouths whispering in English, John Riley's words repeating endlessly. "You've made a mistake. The ship is mine. Tell me a story." Commander Krixan stumbled through the command center, his armor battered, claws trembling, as if the ship's slow death had bled into him. His officers lay motionless, their helmets removed, eyes staring into nothing, as their minds had been pulled into the shadows, leaving only empty vessels behind. The holographic displays, now coated with frost, showed Earth's surface growing closer, the planet's pull gripping the ship as the gravity stabilizers failed and the mothership began its final descent. System override. Initiate emergency protocols. Krixan's voice cracked, but the consoles responded only with static, screens looping with John's image. Sitting by the campfire, his back to the camera, but his shadow stretching, reaching through the screens, as if bridging the gap between reality and nightmare. "You thought you were the hunters." John's voice emerged, not from the comms, but from the walls, the floor, the air itself, but you entered a world where shadows live. You brought fear, but found something far worse. The ship trembled, bulkheads groaned, and metal twisted, as if the vessel itself was alive, recoiling from within. The lights dimmed, and the emergency alarms sang a lullaby, soft, melancholic, as the gravity failed and debris floated, a ballet of ruin. In the lower decks, the remaining soldiers huddled together, their voices blending, as if praying, but their words were only echoes, looping phrases, and shadows moved among them. Human shapes, eyes glowing, and when they blinked, the figures drew closer until the soldiers' shadows peeled away, rising and walking on their own. The energy core, the heart of the mothership, pulsed weakly, its light dim, as if the shadows had swallowed it. The core's containment field shattered, and tendrils of darkness crept in, wrapping around cables, sinking into metal, and the power systems died, one by one, until only the emergency lights remained, casting long shadows that moved with purpose. Prepare for impact. Krixan stumbled, his armor heavy, as if the shadows clung to him, dragging him down, and he reached the control panel, his claws slipping, leaving dark streaks as if the metal sweated ash. Send a distress signal. Alert the homeworld. Warn them. But the transmission panel showed only static, and then John's face emerged, his expression calm, his eyes bright, as if he stood within the ship, but also beyond it, everywhere. There's no one left to warn, Commander, John's image said. Your empire is dust. Your ships are echoes. You enter my world, and now you will remain. The mothership entered Earth's atmosphere, its hull glowing as friction turned metal to fire, and sections of the ship broke away, burning trails across the sky, like falling stars, but no wishes followed, only the promise of an ending. On the surface, humans watched, their eyes reflecting the fire above, as the alien ship, the symbol of their conquerors, became a meteor, crashing into the ocean, sending waves rippling, but leaving only steam and silence. Among the crowds, a lone figure stood, John Riley, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, as if he were merely a bystander. And when someone approached, asking who he was, he only smiled and walked away, his shadow stretching, blending with the twilight, until he was gone. And as night fell, the world turned, and far above, the remnants of the Xelthar fleet drifted, silent, dark, their systems cold, and the stars watched as the legend of Earth spread, of how a single human, with no army and no weapons, had destroyed an empire not with force, but with fear, turning shadows into allies and madness into his sword. In the void, the last transmission from the mothership played endlessly, reaching distant worlds, where alien empires listened, and the message remained the same, a warning, not from John, but from Krixan, his voice broken, his words soft, but echoing through the stars. Do not go to Earth. Do not challenge them. Humans are not what they seem. And so the universe learned, and the stars shifted, as if to turn their gaze away, and Earth remained, a blue world, quiet, ordinary, but beneath the surface where shadows walked and stories whispered, the truth lingered that the galaxy's greatest empire had fallen, and John Riley, wherever he was, still walked among the shadows, waiting for the next mistake.